Welcome to our deep dive. This time we're taking a look at Brené Brown's book, Daring Greatly, and it's all about vulnerability and shame, and this idea she talks about called wholehearted living. We'll break down some of the big ideas, so you don't have to read the whole book. And what really struck me was how she connects this quote from Theodore Roosevelt to the idea of daring greatly.
Oh, yeah.
It is not the critic who counts, not the man who points out how the strong man stumbles or where the doer of deeds could have done them better. The credit belongs to the man who is actually in the arena, whose face is marred by dust and sweat and blood, who strives valiantly, who errs, who comes short again and again because there is no effort without error and shortcoming, but who does actually strive to do the deeds, who knows great enthusiasms, the great devotions, who spends himself in a worthy cause, who at the best knows in the end the triumph of high achievement, and who at the worst, if he fails, at least fails, while daring greatly so that his place shall never be with those cold and timid souls who neither know victory nor defeat.
Wow. Yeah. That is a powerful way to start the conversation because it really makes you think about how we see vulnerability. Like we are so used to thinking of it as weakness. Like we got to avoid it at all costs.
Yeah.
But Brown is saying it's like the very foundation of courage and connection and creativity.
Right, and she doesn't just throw out these big ideas without backing them up. Like, she spent years and years researching vulnerability, interviewing all kinds of people from all walks of life. And what she found really surprised her, it turned out, that the people who lived the most fulfilling lives, the ones who experience like deep joy and connection, are those who are willing to embrace vulnerability.
And what I think is so fascinating is that she started out trying to understand connection, but realized she couldn't do that without understanding shame first. And in fact, one of the things she ran into early on was that people didn't even want to talk about shame.
Oh, yeah.
Like she tells a story about this man who almost skipped her talk because he thought it would be too touchy-feely.
It's like shame is this like taboo topic, something we're afraid to even acknowledge, let alone talk about openly. But her research shows that shame thrives in secrecy. The less we talk about it, the more power it has over us.
And it affects us in so many ways, right? Like without us even realizing it. Sometimes shame can hold us back from going after what we really want, from speaking up, from forming real connections with people. It can show up as perfectionism or people-pleasing or even addiction. Mm-hmm. All those ways we try to numb the pain of feeling unworthy.
Okay, so we see how vulnerability and shame are like super connected, but what does it actually look like to build up shame resilience? Because I think that's what we all want, right? The ability to deal with those tough emotions without letting them control us.
Right. And one of the big things Brown found is that shame resilience is not about avoiding shame altogether. Like that's just not possible. We're all going to feel it at some point. It's more about learning how to recognize it and move through it in a way that helps you grow stronger.
So we need to face those feelings head on instead of running away from them.
Exactly. And she talks about these 4 key elements of shame resilience, and they are recognizing shame, understanding its triggers, practicing critical awareness, challenging those shame-inducing thoughts, reaching out for support and connection, and speaking shame, breaking the silence by sharing our stories with people we trust.
I love that last one, speaking shame, because when we keep all those feelings bottled up inside, they just fester and grow. But when we can share them with someone who listens with empathy and compassion, it can be so healing.
Right. It's like letting the light shine in on those dark parts of our hearts, and it takes away shame's power over us. One of the most powerful parts of the book for me was when she shares her own story about sending that angry email and then just spiraling into a shame attack. It shows that even she, as a shame researcher, falls into these patterns.
That's what makes it so relatable, right? She's not like this vulnerability guru who has it all figured out. She's right there in the trenches with us. And what I found inspiring was how she dealt with that shame afterwards. She didn't try to hide it or pretend it didn't happen. She reached out to her husband and a close friend for support.
Yeah, that act of reaching out, letting others see our imperfections, that's so important for building shame resilience. And it ties into this idea she talks about called wholehearted living, which is about living life from a place of worthiness. It's about believing we are enough, just as we are flaws and all.
But that can be so hard in a culture that's constantly telling us we're not enough, not thin enough, not rich enough, not successful enough. She calls this the culture of scarcity. And we're always striving for more, better, something to finally make us feel worthy.
And that scarcity mindset, it keeps us stuck in this cycle of comparison and competition and self-doubt. It makes us afraid to be vulnerable because we worry about judgment and rejection. So we end up putting on all this armor, perfectionism, people-pleasing, all these defenses that keep us from truly connecting with ourselves and others.
And in that environment of scarcity, that's where shame really thrives, when we constantly feel like we're not enough. It's easy to start believing those messages and feeling like we're just fundamentally flawed or unworthy of love.
And that's where those protective mechanisms come in. Brown talks about 3 main ways we try to shield ourselves from vulnerability and shame, foreboding joy, perfectionism, and numbing.
Okay, let's break those down. What is foreboding joy? I haven't heard that term before.
It's kind of interesting. It's that tendency we have to dampen our own joy. Like when things are going well, we're afraid to get too happy because we think it won't last or something bad will happen.
Oh, I do that all the time. Like if things are going really well in my life, I start thinking, okay, this is too good to be true. Something's got to go wrong soon. It's like I'm almost sabotaging my own happiness.
Right. And it comes from that fear of vulnerability, that belief that we don't deserve to experience pure joy. We're so used to disappointment or pain that we anticipate it even when there's no reason to.
So it's a way of trying to protect ourselves from getting hurt, but it ends up keeping us from really living.
Exactly. And it keeps us stuck in that scarcity cycle because we're never letting ourselves fully enjoy the good moments. We're always bracing for the bad. And that brings us to the next armor, perfectionism.
Last time we were talking about shame and how it can show up as these protective mechanisms that Brown talks about, and perfectionism is a big one. It's this idea that if we can just be perfect, then we can avoid judgment and maybe even shame. But that just doesn't really work, does it?
Yeah, perfectionism, it's a tricky thing. On the surface, it can look like striving for excellence, which isn't bad. But when you really look at it, you see that perfectionism is often driven by fear of failure, fear of not being good enough, fear of shame.
It's that voice in our heads that says, if I'm not perfect, then I'm not worthy. And it can really show up everywhere in our work, in our relationships, even as parents.
And one of the things that Brown points out that I thought was really interesting is that perfectionism isn't actually about striving for excellence. It's about trying to earn approval and avoid criticism. It's like we're trying to control how other people see us, but it actually keeps us from being seen for who we really are.
It's like we're hiding behind this mask, presenting this polished version of ourselves to the world, and in the process, we kind of suffocate our true selves.
Exactly. And that lack of authenticity,
Yeah.
it can lead to this feeling of isolation and disconnection. It's like we're building walls around ourselves to protect ourselves from getting hurt, but those walls are actually keeping us from experiencing true intimacy and connection.
Yeah, I remember that image of perfectionism as a 20-ton shield that really stuck with me. We think it's protecting us, but it's actually weighing us down and keeping us from really living.
It's such a great metaphor. Brown says that real connection and belonging come from letting people see us flaws and all, embracing our imperfections and recognizing that we're all a work in progress.
But letting go of that need to be perfect, that can be so hard, especially in a culture that's so obsessed with achievement and success. So where do we even start?
Well, Brown suggests starting with gratitude. When we focus on what we're grateful for, it shifts our perspective from scarcity to abundance. It reminds us that we have enough, we are enough just as we are.
I love that it's about appreciating the good things instead of always focusing on what we lack. And it makes sense because when we're feeling grateful, it's harder to get caught up in that perfectionistic mindset.
Right. Another really important piece is self-compassion. Treating ourselves with the same kindness and understanding that we would offer a close friend.
Yeah, we tend to be so much harder on ourselves than we are on anyone else. We criticize ourselves for our mistakes and beat ourselves up for not being good enough.
Self-compassion is about recognizing that we're all imperfect. We all make mistakes, and it's okay to be kind to ourselves even when we mess up. It's about giving ourselves the grace and space to be human.
One of the things I found really interesting in the book was how Brown explores creativity as an antidote to perfectionism. She talks about how artists and creatives tend to be more comfortable with imperfection because they understand that the creative process is messy and unpredictable.
It's true. There's no such thing as a perfect painting or a perfect song, and that's part of what makes art so beautiful. And moving it reflects the messiness and imperfection of life itself.
Yeah, that quote from one of the artists Brown interviewed really resonated with me. She said, "The world of art, like the human experience, is messy and imperfect." It's a good reminder that we don't have to have it all figured out. We don't have to present this perfect facade to the world. We can embrace the mess, the cracks, and still be worthy of love and belonging.
Absolutely. And actually, it's often in those cracks and imperfections that we find our greatest strengths and our most authentic selves.
Thinking about this whole idea of letting go of perfection, I'm realizing how much it has held me back in my own life, from taking risks, from going after my passions, from putting myself out there.
I think that's true for a lot of us. Perfectionism keeps us playing it safe, but also keeps us from experiencing all that life has to offer. It robs us of the joy of discovery, the excitement of adventure, and the deep satisfaction of living a life that's true to ourselves.
So how do we break free from that perfectionistic trap? What's the path to daring greatly, like Brown says?
I think it's a few things together: practicing gratitude, cultivating self-compassion, embracing imperfection, and giving ourselves permission to be creative. And it's also about learning to set boundaries, something that can bring up a lot of shame and discomfort.
That's true. Setting boundaries can feel selfish or mean, especially if we're people pleasers by nature. But Brown says boundaries are essential for protecting our time, energy, and emotional well-being.
And she reminds us that we can't give what we don't have. If we're constantly depleted and running on empty, we can't show up fully for ourselves or the people we care about.
It's like that oxygen mask on the airplane. You have to put your own mask on first before you can help anyone else. We have to take care of ourselves if we want to show up for others.
Exactly. And Brown also talks about how setting boundaries can actually make our relationships stronger because it allows us to be more authentic and communicate our needs more clearly.
I love that she shares her own struggles with boundary setting. She talks about how she used to have a hard time saying no to speaking engagements even when she was exhausted and overcommitted.
I can totally relate to that. We feel this pressure to say yes to everything, even when it's not good for us. But Brown realized that saying no to the things that drain us frees us up to say yes to the things that really matter.
And it's about recognizing that we have the right to protect our time and energy. We don't have to be everything to everyone.
One thing I've noticed in my own life is that the more I practice setting boundaries, the less resentment I feel, and the more I'm able to show up as my true self in my relationships.
That makes sense when we're always overextending ourselves. It's easy to feel resentful and burned out. But when we set boundaries, we're creating space for ourselves to recharge and connect with others from a place of wholeness, not depletion. Welcome back to our deep dive into daring greatly. We've been talking about vulnerability and shame and wholehearted living. And while it's been so interesting to learn about these concepts, I'm curious about how we actually put this stuff into practice.
Yeah, it's definitely one thing to read about it and another to actually live it. And Brown gets that. She spends a good chunk of the book talking about practical strategies for daring greatly in our everyday lives.
Okay, so let's get into that. Where do we even start? What are some actual things we can do to cultivate more vulnerability and courage?
Well, one area where a lot of people struggle is with those really difficult conversations, the ones we tend to avoid because they involve conflict or potential hurt feelings or giving tough feedback.
Oh, yeah. Those conversations make my stomach churn just thinking about them. But I also know that avoiding them usually just makes things worse in the long run.
That's exactly what Brown found. We avoid these conversations because we don't want to seem mean or confrontational or uncaring. But that avoidance often leads to more disconnection and resentment in our relationships.
So how do we approach those conversations in a way that's honest and compassionate? How do we speak our truth without bulldozing over the other person's feelings?
One of the things Brown suggests is to go into those conversations with a mindset of sitting next to the problem rather than across from it.
I like that visual. What does that actually look like?
It's about seeing yourself and the other person as a team, working together to understand and resolve the issue. You're putting the problem on the table instead of between you and approaching it with a shared goal of finding a solution.
So it's like taking the focus off of blame and judgment and creating space for collaboration.
Exactly. And it requires vulnerability from both sides, being willing to acknowledge our own part in the problem and really listen to the other person's perspective.
I think it's also important to remember that even when we're talking about a challenge or giving critical feedback, we can still acknowledge the other person's strengths.
Oh, for sure. It's so easy to get caught up in the negative.
Yeah.
But starting with what's working, what we appreciate can make the other person much more receptive to the harder stuff.
It's like building a bridge of trust and respect before you deliver the difficult message. And it reminds me of that point Brown makes about how we can't give what we don't have. If we want to offer empathy and compassion to others, we need to cultivate those qualities within ourselves first.
Right. It's like you can't pour from an empty cup. Taking care of our own emotional well-being, setting boundaries, practicing self-compassion, all of those things help us show up for others with more generosity and understanding.
And speaking of showing up, I think parenting is a huge area where all of this comes into play. It's such a vulnerable experience, and it's so easy to get caught up in the pressure to do everything right.
Absolutely. Parenting is like a crash course in vulnerability. We're constantly facing our own limitations, our own fears and insecurities, and it's easy to fall into comparing ourselves to other parents or trying to live up to some perfect ideal.
Which, as we've been talking about, is just a recipe for shame and disconnection. So what does daring greatly look like as a parent?
It's about showing up authentically, Even when we're tired or stressed or feeling like we have no clue what we're doing, it's about being present with our kids, listening to their needs and validating their emotions, even the messy ones.
And it's about being willing to make mistakes, to apologize when we mess up, and to model healthy ways of coping for our kids. We're not going to be perfect parents, and that's okay.
In fact, Brown says that our imperfections are where our kids learn the most valuable lessons about resilience, forgiveness, and self-acceptance. She talks about how important it is to normalize shame for kids, helping them understand it's a normal human emotion and teaching them how to work through it.
Yeah, that story about her daughter being labeled the other at recess was so heartbreaking, but also so relatable for anyone who has ever felt excluded or like they didn't belong.
It's a good reminder that our kids are going to experience shame no matter what, but we can give them the tools to deal with those experiences in a healthy way. We can teach them to recognize shame, challenge the negative thoughts, and reach out for support.
And we can create a family culture where vulnerability is okay and even celebrated, where mistakes are seen as chances to grow, and where everyone feels safe to be themselves.
Brown also talks about the importance of teaching kids the difference between shame and guilt. Guilt is about our behavior, like, I did something wrong, but shame is about who we are, like, I am bad.
That's a really important difference. Guilt can motivate us to make amends and learn from our mistakes, while shame just keeps us stuck in self-loathing.
Exactly. And when we teach kids to tell the difference between those two emotions, we're giving them the power to take responsibility for their actions without internalizing negative beliefs about themselves.
So as we wrap up this deep dive into daring greatly, what's the main thing you hope our listeners take away from it?
I hope they remember that vulnerability is not weakness. It's the courage to show up to be seen and to risk getting hurt. It's the path to deeper connection, greater authenticity, and a more fulfilling life.
And it's a journey, not a destination. We're not going to be perfect at it, and that's okay. The important thing is to keep showing up, keep practicing, and keep choosing courage over comfort.
I love that. And I would add that we're not alone in this. We all struggle with vulnerability and shame. But by sharing our stories, supporting each other, and being kind, we can create a world where everyone feels safe to dare greatly.
Thank you for joining us on this deep dive. We hope it's inspired you to step into the arena of your own life and dare greatly.